Betrayal at Blackwood Hall, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. A gathering at Blackwood Hall. The train from York had been delayed twice, and by the time it deposited me at the small, wind-scoured platform of Thornbeck Holt, the light was already failing over the moors. I confess I had half a mind to turn back and find a warm inn, but a motor car was waiting, sent by Sir Marcus Blackwood himself, and the driver, a taciturn man named Digby, informed me that Monsieur Poirot had already arrived some 2 hours before. I had not seen my old friend in several months, and it was with considerable pleasure that I anticipated our reunion, even as the invitation itself struck me as peculiar. Sir Marcus Blackwood, the shipping magnate whose fleets carried wool and machinery from Hull to half the ports of the world, was not a man I had ever met, nor one whose social circle I might reasonably expect to enter. Poirot's note had been characteristically economical. "Come to Blackwood Hall this Friday, mon ami. I believe there will be much for the little grey cells to occupy themselves with, and I confess I should like a friendly face among the company." Blackwood Hall itself rose out of the darkening moorland like something carved rather than built, a great grey pile of Jacobean stone, with mullioned windows now beginning to glow amber against the coming night. Snow had begun to fall in earnest as we climbed the last rise, fine and dry, the sort that promises to settle and does not stop. I was shown into a drawing-room of considerable grandeur, where a fire roared beneath a mantel crowded with hunting trophies, and where Hercule Poirot sat very upright in a wing-chair, his patent leather shoes gleaming, his moustaches waxed to their usual military points, looking for all the world as though he had been poured into the room by design. "Hastings! Ah, but this is good. Come, come, warm yourself." He rose and gripped my hand with real affection. "You have had a miserable journey, I think. The trains in this country, they possess a genius for disappointment. Never mind the trains, Poirot. What is all this about? Why are we here?" He glanced about the room, lowering his voice, though we were for the moment alone. "Sir Marcus Blackwood wrote to me a fortnight past. He believed, no, he was convinced, that someone in this house intends to do him harm. He did not say who, he did not say why, beyond hinting at old grievances long buried. He asked me to come and observe, discreetly, under the pretext of an old acquaintance of his solicitor, a Mr. Pemberton, who arranged the introduction." "And do you believe him, that someone means him harm?" "I believe," said Poirot slowly, "that Sir Marcus Blackwood is a man who has spent his life making enemies in the pursuit of profit, and that a man who makes enemies for 40 years should not be surprised when one of them, at last, calls upon him." Before I could press him further, the door opened and the company began to assemble for the hour before dinner, and I had my first sight of the household that would occupy us so terribly in the days to come. Lady Eleanor Blackwood entered first, Sir Marcus's second wife, a woman perhaps 35, dark-haired, with the kind of composed beauty that seemed to have been arranged rather than simply possessed. She greeted Poirot with polite reserve, and myself with a distracted nod, her eyes moving continually toward the door as though expecting, or dreading, some other arrival. Close behind her came Julian Blackwood, Sir Marcus's son by his first marriage, a lean young man with restless hands and the pallor of one who keeps late hours at the card table. He poured himself a whisky before he had properly entered the room, and did not offer one to anyone else. Mr. Vivian Ashworth, I learned, was Sir Marcus's business partner of some 20 years' standing, a heavy-set man with a florid face and an air of joviality that did not quite reach his eyes. He shook my hand with unnecessary vigour and told me, unprompted, what a very great pleasure it was to have guests of quality at the hall, as though he owned it himself. Miss Constance Fairweather came in last and quietest of all, Sir Marcus's ward, orphaned young and raised at his expense, a slight young woman of perhaps 24, with fair hair drawn back plainly, and eyes that seemed always to be observing rather than participating. She took a seat near the window, apart from the others, and spoke to no one until spoken to. Mr. Simon Latch, the private secretary, hovered near the door with a leather folder of papers, clearly uncertain whether business or society was expected of him at this hour. Mrs. Prudence Hartley, the housekeeper, appeared briefly to confer with him in a whisper before withdrawing. And Dr. Edgar Voss, the family physician, and, I gathered, an old friend of the house, arrived last of all, stamping snow from his boots and complaining cheerfully of the weather, before catching sight of Poirot, and pausing only for a moment, but I noted it, as I believe Poirot did also, with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite alarm. "A full house, mon ami," Poirot murmured to me, as the gong sounded for dinner, "and somewhere among these pleasant faces, unless I am very much mistaken, sits a person who wishes our host dead. We have only to discover which." I did not then imagine how soon, and how terribly, that wish would be granted. Chapter 2. The storm closes in dinner. At Blackwood Hall was, I am bound to say, an uncomfortable affair, though the food was excellent and the wine plentiful. Sir Marcus Blackwood did not appear until the soup had already been cleared away, entering with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never in his life been kept waiting and does not trouble himself over keeping others so. He was a big man, gone somewhat to fat in his 60s, with small shrewd eyes set deep in a weathered face, and hands that gestured constantly as he spoke, as though even his conversation were a form of commerce. He greeted Poirot with a curt nod. "Glad you came, Mr. Poirot, glad you came," and myself scarcely at all, before taking his place at the head of the table. Before we continue, a quick message for every mystery lover. If you're enjoying this story, you'll love the Baker Street Library, my collection of exclusive detective mystery ebooks available only in ebook format. Download instantly and enjoy your next investigation anytime. You'll find the link in the description, the pinned comment, and the channel description. Now, let's get back to the mystery. And surveying his family and guests with an expression I can only describe as proprietary. "Snowing hard," he observed, to no one in particular. "Digby says the road to Thornbeck will be closed by morning if it keeps on. Well, no matter. We shall be cosy enough here, shan't we?" He smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. "Might even be an advantage. Keeps everyone where I can see them." Lady Eleanor's hand tightened almost imperceptibly upon her wineglass. Julian Blackwood stared fixedly at his plate. Ashworth laughed too loudly at a remark that had not, in truth, been very amusing. It was over the fish course that Sir Marcus made the announcement that I have since come to think of as the true beginning of the tragedy. "I've been meaning to say something to all of you," he said, setting down his fork with a deliberateness that commanded attention, "and I don't see any reason to wait for a more convenient moment. I've had Pemberton draw up a new will." The silence that followed was so complete that I distinctly heard the fire settle in the grate 2 rooms away. "I'm not a sentimental man," Sir Marcus went on, evidently enjoying himself. "I built this business with my own 2 hands, and I don't intend to see it frittered away by people who never lifted a finger to earn it." His eyes moved deliberately to his son. "Julian, you've had every chance and you've squandered every one of them. Cards, horses, and worse. You'll get an allowance, and it will be a good deal smaller than the one you've been used to." Julian's knuckles whitened around his glass, but he said nothing. "Vivian," Ashworth's smile had entirely vanished. "I know what you've been doing with the Rotterdam accounts. Don't trouble to deny it. Latch has the figures, and Latch does not make mistakes. I haven't decided yet whether to prosecute or simply buy you out at a shilling in the pound. I'll let you stew on it a while longer. Marcus, I really must protest. You may protest all you like, over the port." Sir Marcus turned, almost gently, toward his ward. "Constance, my dear, none of this concerns you unfavourably. Your provision stands as it was. You've never given me a moment's trouble, which is more than I can say for most people at this table." Constance Fairweather said nothing at all, though I saw her gaze flicker, very briefly, toward Lady Eleanor, and something passed between the two women that I could not then read. As for you, my dear, Sir Marcus's tone, addressing his wife, took on an edge I did not like, something almost gleeful in its cruelty. We shall discuss your position privately. I think you know why. Lady Eleanor's face had gone quite white, but she said only, "As you wish, Marcus," in a voice of perfect steadiness, that cost her, I think, a very great effort. I glanced at Poirot. He was watching the table with the unblinking attention of a man at the theatre who suspects the play is about to take an unexpected turn, his small eyes moving from face to face. Missing, I would have wagered, nothing at all. The remainder of dinner passed in a stiff and watchful silence, broken only by Sir Marcus's own hearty and apparently untroubled conversation, directed chiefly at Dr. Voss on the subject of his health, and at myself on the subject of the war, neither of which topic he seemed to expect any real response to. Afterward, in the drawing-room, the company dispersed with unusual haste. Julian Blackwood took himself off toward the billiard-room without a word. Ashworth cornered Simon Latch by the window and spoke to him in a low, urgent undertone that ceased the moment I came near. Lady Eleanor retired early, pleading a headache, and Constance Fairweather slipped away so quietly that I scarcely noticed her going. "Well, Poirot," I said, when at last we had a moment alone by the fire, "I begin to understand why our host feared for his safety. He seems to have gone out of his way this evening to make himself thoroughly hated by everyone at the table." "Précisément, mon ami. It is a curious thing to watch a man arrange, with such evident care, the circumstances of his own destruction." Poirot's eyes were troubled. "He plays a dangerous game, this Sir Marcus. He believes that by threatening everyone equally, he protects himself, that no one will act while suspicion might fall equally upon all. But this is not so. A man who is frightened does not calculate so carefully as he supposes, and a man who has decided, truly decided, that murder is his only remedy, he does not wait for a convenient season. You think one of them means to kill him tonight?" Poirot spread his hands. "I think, Hastings, that we are shut up in this house by the snow, with a man who has just this evening given 4 separate people a very excellent reason to wish him in his grave. I think I shall not sleep soundly until morning. And I think," he glanced toward the tall windows where the snow fell now in a thick, silent curtain against the black glass, "that we are, all of us, going to be here rather longer than any of us intended." He was right, of course, though neither of us could have foreseen quite how right, nor how soon the household would be plunged into horror. Chapter 3. The Silence of the Study. I was woken shortly after 7 the following morning by a sound I did not at first identify, a low, continuous moaning that seemed to come from somewhere below my window. Dressing hurriedly, I went down to find the great hall in a state of confusion, servants standing about in small, frightened knots, and Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, sitting quite white and rigid upon a hall chair, while a young housemaid wept openly beside her. "What has happened?" I demanded of the first footman I encountered. "It's Sir Marcus, sir," the man said, his voice unsteady. "Mary went in to lay the fire in the study, sir, and he's dead, sir, dead in his chair." I found Poirot already at the study door, fully dressed despite the early hour, speaking in low tones to Simon Latch, who stood wringing his hands with an expression of profound shock. "Hastings, good. Do not let anyone enter until Poirot has looked, if you please." He turned to Latch. "You say the door was locked from within?" "Yes. That is, I found it locked when I came to bring him the morning post, as I do every day at 7:30. I knocked, and there was no answer, and I confess I feared he had been taken ill in the night, so I fetched the spare key from Mrs. Hartley's cupboard." The study of Sir Marcus Blackwood was a large, comfortable room, lined with account ledgers and shipping charts, a heavy oak desk dominating its centre, and it was there, in the chair behind that desk, that we found him, slumped forward, his face turned to one side, quite dead, and had been, by the look of him, for some hours. Poirot approached with the peculiar delicacy he reserved for such moments, touching nothing, his eyes moving swiftly over the desk, the fireplace, the tall windows, closed and, I noted, latched from within, and finally to the body itself. "No wound," he murmured. "No blood. Observe, Hastings, the position of the hands, the colour of the lips. A faint blue tinge, do you see it? And here, upon the desk, a glass, quite empty, and this small brown bottle." He bent close without touching it. "Dr. Voss's prescription, I think we shall find, for a weak heart. Digitalis, perhaps, or something of that family." Dr. Voss himself arrived at that moment, summoned in haste, and his examination, brief, professional, but visibly shaken, confirmed what Poirot had already surmised in outline, though not, as yet, in detail. "Heart failure, by every outward sign," Voss said, straightening at last. "He had angina, you know. I had been treating him for it these 2 years past. It would surprise no one who knew him that his heart gave out at last. He drove himself too hard, ate too well, and would take no care of himself whatever I told him." "And yet," said Poirot gently, "you do not seem entirely convinced by your own diagnosis, Dr. Voss." The doctor's eyes met his, and something flickered there. Calculation or fear, I could not tell which. "I shall want to examine the medicine bottle more closely before I say anything further, Mr. Poirot. A weak heart may stop of its own accord. It may also be persuaded to stop by other means, if a man knew what he was about." "Digitalis," Poirot said softly, almost to himself, "is a most convenient poison for a murderer, Dr. Voss, precisely because it mimics so faithfully the death it is administered to cause. A little too much of a medicine a man already takes. Who is to say it was not his own unsteady hand that measured the dose?" The local constabulary, when they arrived some 2 hours later, for the snow had indeed closed the Thornbeck road, and it was only by considerable effort that Constable Higgins and, somewhat later, Inspector Radley from the county town managed the journey, found a household united in shock and grief so thoroughgoing that I confess I found it difficult, that first terrible morning, to credit that any one of them concealed a murderer's hand. Yet Poirot, I observed, was not so easily persuaded of the general innocence. "You noticed, Hastings, how very quickly Dr. Voss suggested murder himself, before anyone else had dared to speak the word, and how Mr. Latch, who found the body, was fully dressed and entirely composed at 7:30, though he claims to have slept as poorly as the rest of the house. And Lady Eleanor did not come down at all, until the news had already spread through every corridor. A woman who, I think, wished to compose herself very thoroughly before she was obliged to display an appropriate grief. You suspect them already. I suspect everyone, mon ami, a little, and no one very much, which is the correct condition for the early hours of an investigation. It is only the detective who convinces himself too soon, who arrives, in the end, at the wrong murderer. He glanced back toward the closed study door, where Inspector Radley's men were now at work. "But I will say this. A locked room, a dying man's own medicine, and a household to whom he had, not 12 hours before, promised ruin, disinheritance, and disgrace in roughly equal measure. It is not, I think, going to be a very difficult case to investigate. It is going to be a very difficult case to prove." Chapter 4. Monsieur Poirot takes charge. Inspector Radley proved, greatly to my relief, a sensible man rather than an obstinate one, and upon learning that Sir Marcus had specifically summoned Hercule Poirot a fortnight previously out of fear for his own life, he was inclined to defer to my friend's judgment, rather more than local inspectors are generally willing to do. "Between ourselves, Mr. Poirot," he said, drawing us aside into the small morning room that had been given over to the investigation, "I don't like the look of this above half. Dr. Voss tells me the digitalis bottle shows signs of tampering, the seal broken and reset, if you follow me, and the dosage markings altered in pencil, very cleverly, so that a man measuring his usual amount would in fact take 3 or 4 times the safe quantity. "This confirms what I had already suspected," said Poirot. "And the glass? Whiskey and water, with a heavy dose of the digitalis dissolved in it. Death would have come within the hour, the doctor thinks. Perhaps less, given the quantity involved." Sir Marcus dismissed his valet at 11, as was his habit, and told him he intended to work late upon his correspondence. No one admits to seeing him alive after that hour. "And the door was locked from within, you say?" "Locked and bolted, sir, with the key still in the lock upon the inside. The windows were latched. There is no other way into that room." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "A most interesting complication, Inspector. Either Sir Marcus locked himself in and poisoned himself, which I think we may set aside, since a man does not generally take pains to alter his own medicine bottle against a suicide he has not yet decided upon, or the murderer contrived to leave a locked room behind him, which is a very old trick, and generally a very simple one, once explained. I do not think, Inspector, that we need trouble ourselves overmuch with the mechanics of the lock. I think rather we should occupy ourselves with the question of who had opportunity to tamper with that bottle before 11 o'clock, and who had reason to wish Sir Marcus Blackwood in his grave before Monday morning. "That's a long list, from what I've already heard below stairs," Radley said grimly. "The whole household seems to have had a quarrel with him at dinner." "Then we must begin," said Poirot, rising and settling his waistcoat with characteristic precision, "at the beginning, and proceed with method. I should like to speak with each member of the household in turn, Inspector, if you have no objection, and I should like Captain Hastings to remain with me, for he has a very useful gift of observing what people do while I occupy myself with what they say." Radley, evidently a man who recognized a superior intelligence when it stood before him, agreed readily enough, and it was arranged that the interviews should begin that same afternoon, in the library, where a fire had been lit against the bitter cold that pressed in at every window. "One thing more, Inspector, before we begin," Poirot said, pausing at the door. "The medicine bottle. Who besides Dr. Voss would have known the correct dosage, and known, moreover, how to alter it without arousing suspicion?" "Anyone in the house, I should think, Mr. Poirot. It stood on the study mantelpiece in plain view, and Sir Marcus was not a man who troubled to hide his ailments. He spoke of his heart trouble often enough, and loudly, as he seemed to speak of everything. Then it is not the opportunity to alter the bottle that will distinguish our murderer," Poirot murmured, half to himself, "but the opportunity to do so unobserved, and the temperament to plan so carefully and wait so patiently for the moment to act. These are qualities, Hastings, that do not announce themselves upon a person's face. We shall have to look a good deal deeper than that." Chapter 5. Little Grey Cells at Work. Our first interview was with Julian Blackwood, who entered the library with the defensive swagger of a young man who expects to be accused and has decided to meet accusation with bravado rather than dignity. "I suppose you want to know if I killed my father," he said, dropping into a chair without invitation. "Everyone else seems to think so already. I heard the servants whispering about it before breakfast. I want to know, monsieur, where you were between 11 o'clock last night and 1 this morning," Poirot said mildly. "In the billiard room, mostly. Alone, mostly, which I don't suppose does me any credit. I went up to bed sometime after midnight. I couldn't tell you exactly when. I didn't murder my father, Mr. Poirot, whatever you may think of my character otherwise. I had no reason to. He'd already told me I was cut off. Killing him wouldn't have restored my allowance. It would only have hastened the moment when Pemberton read out just how little I'm to have. Unless, monsieur, you believed that the new will had not yet been signed." Julian went very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean," said Poirot, "that a will announced at dinner is not the same thing as a will executed before a solicitor and witnessed according to law. If the new will had not yet been signed, then the old will, under which I think you stood to inherit a very great deal more, remained in force. A man in your position, monsieur, might reason that his father's death occurring before the new will was made legal, would restore to him everything the old will had promised. I watched Julian's face very closely, and I saw something there that was not quite guilt, but was certainly calculation, quickly suppressed. "I didn't know that," he said at last, unconvincingly. "I don't know anything about legal documents. That's Latch's business and Pemberton's." "Then you will not object," said Poirot pleasantly. "If I ask Mr. Pemberton, when the roads permit him to travel, exactly when this new will was to have been signed." "Ask whoever you like," Julian said, and left the room rather more quickly than he had entered it. Vivian Ashworth, when his turn came, was a study in studied calm that fooled neither Poirot nor myself. "A terrible business," he said, settling his considerable bulk into the chair Julian had vacated. "Terrible. Marcus and I were partners 20 years, Mr. Poirot. Whatever our differences, I never wished the man dead. And yet he accused you, before the whole table, of falsifying accounts." Ashworth's smile did not waver, though a muscle worked at the corner of his jaw. "A misunderstanding, nothing more. Marcus had a way of leaping to conclusions when he'd had a glass or two of wine. I should have straightened it out with him this morning, if matters had permitted. Where were you between 11 and 1 last night, monsieur?" "In my room, reading. Alone, I'm afraid. I can offer no witness to it, which I know looks badly, but there it is. I'm not in the habit of arranging alibis for myself against the possibility of murder." Poirot inclined his head, made a small note, and thanked him with a courtesy that gave nothing whatever away. It was Constance Fairweather who surprised me most, for where I had expected timidity, I found instead a kind of quiet, watchful composure that seemed older than her years. "I don't believe anyone in this house killed Sir Marcus for gain, Mr. Poirot," she said, when he had put his preliminary questions to her. "I think whoever did it hated him. There is a difference, I believe, between killing for money and killing because a person cannot any longer bear to watch someone continue to exist." "That is a very penetrating observation, mademoiselle, for one who claims to have no theory of the crime." "I have lived in this house 12 years, she said simply. "One learns to observe when one has no other occupation." "And did you hate him, Miss Fairweather?" Her pale eyes met his without flinching. "He raised me, fed me, clothed me, and never once, in 12 years, spoke to me as though I were anything more than an obligation he had agreed to discharge. I do not know that hate is the right word. I think perhaps I simply never allowed myself to feel anything about him at all." She rose. "I was in my room from 10 o'clock, Mr. Poirot, alone. I imagine that will have to suffice, as it has for everyone else in this house." When she had gone, Poirot sat for a long moment in silence, his fingers steepled before him. "An interesting young woman, Hastings. You don't suspect her, surely? She seems the least likely person in the house to have done such a thing." "Mon ami," said Poirot gently, "in my experience, it is very often the least likely person who has had the most time and the most patience to plan a thing very thoroughly indeed." Chapter 6. The Obvious Suspect. By the second day of our confinement at Blackwood Hall, for the snow showed no sign of relenting, and the road to Thornbeck remained impassable, Inspector Radley had arrived at a theory of the crime that struck me, I confess, as entirely reasonable. "It's the son, Mr. Poirot," he said, drawing us aside after luncheon with the satisfied air of a man who has solved a puzzle to his own complete satisfaction. "Julian Blackwood. We found a letter in his room, a moneylender in York, pressing him most urgently for a debt of some £400, threatening to go to Sir Marcus directly if it wasn't settled by the month's end. There's your motive, clear as day, and you yourself pointed out he'd inherit a fortune under the old will that the new one would have taken from him. It is certainly suggestive, Inspector. More than suggestive, sir. And here's the thing. Mary, the housemaid, says she saw someone in the passage outside the study at 11:30 last night. A man's figure, she thinks, though she couldn't swear to a face in that light. and Julian Blackwood has no one to vouch for his whereabouts at that hour. Neither, if I recall correctly, does Mr. Ashworth, nor Dr. Voss, nor, for that matter, Miss Fairweather, Poirot observed mildly. Ah, but none of them had £400 of pressing debt and a fortune waiting to be restored to them by their father's timely death, Radley said, with the air of a man delivering a decisive stroke. I mean to have Julian Blackwood's movements gone over very carefully indeed, Mr. Poirot, and I shouldn't be surprised if we have our man by nightfall. Poirot said nothing to discourage him, though I saw, in the small crease between his brows, that he was very far from sharing the inspector's confidence. You do not agree, I said, when Radley had gone off to pursue his theory. I do not disagree exactly, Hastings. It is entirely possible that Julian Blackwood is guilty. He had motive, and if the maid's account is accurate, he may well have had opportunity. But observe, everything that points to Julian Blackwood is the sort of evidence that announces itself very loudly and very conveniently. A letter left where the police will surely find it, a figure glimpsed in a dim passage, general enough in description to fit half the men in this house. It has the character, Hastings, of evidence that has been arranged for discovery, rather than evidence that has simply been found. You think someone is trying to direct suspicion toward Julian deliberately. I think, mon ami, that it would be very convenient for the true murderer if Inspector Radley were to arrest Julian Blackwood by nightfall and consider the matter closed, and I think we should not oblige him, or her, by permitting this to happen quite so easily. We took a turn about the frozen garden before returning to our work, for Poirot professed that his little grey cells functioned a good deal better with a little honest English cold to sharpen them, whatever his opinion of English trains. The grounds of Blackwood Hall, buried now beneath a foot of undisturbed snow, presented a scene of such perfect and deceptive tranquillity that I found it difficult, walking there, to credit the violence that had so recently disturbed the house behind us. Consider, Hastings, the peculiar temper of this household, Poirot said, his hands clasped behind his back, his small footprints marking a neat and deliberate line in the snow beside my own less careful tread. In 20 years of investigating the darker impulses of my fellow man, I have observed that a house ruled by fear produces one of two results. Either the fear breaks a person entirely, so that he becomes incapable of anything beyond frightened obedience, and I do not think this describes anyone we have yet met at Blackwood Hall, or the fear is absorbed over years and transmuted into something far more dangerous, a patience, a watchfulness, a willingness to wait for precisely the right moment. I begin to suspect, mon ami, that we are dealing with a household in which every single person has, in his or her own private fashion, absorbed Sir Marcus's cruelty for so long that any one of them might have been capable, given sufficient provocation, of striking back at last. That is a rather bleak view of human nature, Poirot. It is not bleak, Hastings, merely observant. Human nature is neither so bleak nor so bright as we generally suppose, but it is remarkably patient and remarkably good at waiting for its moment. Come, let us return to the warmth and to the evidence, which I think will serve us rather better than philosophy on so cold a morning. He rose and reached for his coat. Come, Hastings, I wish to examine the study once more, and this time I wish to look not at what is there, but at what is very slightly wrong with what is there. We found the study much as it had been left, the desk undisturbed at Radley's instruction, the small brown medicine bottle now removed to the local police surgeon for analysis, but its position on the mantelpiece marked with a small chalk cross. Poirot moved about the room with the slow, deliberate tread of a man committing every detail to memory, pausing at the desk, at the fireplace, at the tall curtained windows, and finally before a handsome grandfather clock that stood against the far wall, its pendulum now stilled, for no one had thought to wind it since the tragedy. This clock, Hastings, it stopped according to Mrs. Hartley at some time yesterday morning, having simply run down, as such clocks do if neglected. But observe the hour at which it stopped. He pointed to the still face. 20 minutes past 11. A coincidence, surely. Clocks stop when they stop. Perhaps. And yet Mrs. Hartley tells me it is wound every evening at 10 o'clock without fail, and that it runs, when properly wound, for some 30 hours before requiring attention again. If it was wound as usual last evening, Hastings, it ought not to have stopped until sometime this afternoon, not at 20 minutes past 11 last night, a bare hour and 20 minutes after winding. I confess I did not immediately grasp the significance of this. Perhaps Mrs. Hartley forgot to wind it. Perhaps, said Poirot again, in the tone of a man who does not believe it for a moment. Or perhaps, mon ami, someone in this room last night had reason to stop that clock deliberately, at a very particular hour, and did not trouble to consider that a stopped clock, in a case such as this, is very often more informative than a clock that continues faithfully to tell the truth. Chapter 7. A discrepancy in time. It was Simon Latch who provided, quite unwittingly, the thread that Poirot seized upon with evident satisfaction. The secretary had proved, throughout our 2 days at Blackwood Hall, a nervous and unhappy witness, answering every question with a kind of anxious precision that suggested a man determined to be scrupulously accurate and terrified, in equal measure, of saying too much. You found Sir Marcus at 7:30, you say, when you brought the Morning Post, Poirot said, when Latch had been summoned once more to the library. But you told Inspector Radley, I believe, that you had also gone to the study once during the night. Is this not so? Latch's hands, folded in his lap, tightened visibly. Yes. I had forgotten to mention it before. I went down at perhaps 11:15 to leave some papers on the desk that Sir Marcus had asked me to prepare before he retired. I did not go in. The door was locked, and I assumed he had already gone up to bed and would find the papers in the morning, so I left them beneath the door instead. You did not knock. No. I did not wish to disturb him if he had already retired. And yet you say the door was locked. How did you know this, monsieur, if you did not try it? A long silence. I tried the handle, Latch admitted at last, very low. It did not turn. I assumed he had locked it from within, as he sometimes did when he wished to work without interruption. And you heard nothing from within the room? No voice, no movement? Nothing, Mr. Poirot. I swear it. The house was entirely silent. Poirot regarded him for a long moment with those bright, unreadable eyes. One more question, Mr. Latch, and I ask you to consider it very carefully before you answer. The grandfather clock in the study, do you recall whether it was still ticking when you stood at that door at 11:15? Latch's brow furrowed in genuine effort of memory. Yes, I believe it was. I remember now. I could hear it quite distinctly through the door, in the silence. It has a very particular sound, that clock, a kind of heavy tick. He frowned. Why do you ask, Mr. Poirot? Because, monsieur, that clock had stopped, according to the evidence of its own hands, at 20 minutes past 11, some 25 minutes before you say you heard it ticking through a locked door. Poirot's voice was very quiet now, very precise. One of two things is true, Mr. Latch. Either your memory deceives you as to the hour of your visit to that door, or the clock did not, in fact, stop at the hour its hands suggest, and someone has since altered them to indicate a false time. I do not think, from the great confidence with which you have recalled every other detail of that visit, that your memory is at fault. Latch had gone quite pale. Are you suggesting, Mr. Poirot, that I am lying? I am suggesting, monsieur, that someone in this house wishes us to believe that Sir Marcus Blackwood died at 20 minutes past 11, when in truth he may have died a good deal later, or indeed somewhat earlier, and the clock's hands moved forward rather than allowed simply to run down. A stopped clock is easily arranged, Mr. Latch, by any hand that knows the trick of it, and it is a very old trick indeed for establishing a false time of death. When Latch had gone, white and shaken, I turned to Poirot in some bewilderment. But what does it profit the murderer to falsify the hour, Poirot? Surely it only complicates matters. On the contrary, mon ami, it is of the first importance. If the true hour of death lies later than we have assumed, say, past midnight, then several of our suspects who believed themselves safely accounted for during the early evening find their alibis considerably less secure. And if it lies earlier? Well, he tapped his temple. I have an idea forming, Hastings, though it is not yet ready to be spoken aloud. Let us say only that I begin to suspect our murderer of a very cool head and a very patient temperament. Qualities I have observed, I think, in one member of this household above all the others. Chapter 8. Whispers Below Stairs. That evening, while Poirot occupied himself with what he described as the tedious but necessary business of the little grey cells reviewing their notes, I took it upon myself to seek out Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, in the small sitting-room off the kitchen passage where the senior servants took their tea. I have generally found that a friendly ear and a willingness to listen will draw out confidences that no amount of formal questioning can produce. And Mrs. Hartley, still shaken by the events of the past 2 days, proved no exception. 20 years I've kept house here, Captain Hastings, and I never thought to see the master done to death in his own study, she said, dabbing at her eyes. Though I'll say this much, and I'd not say it to the inspector, for it isn't my place. There's few enough in this house who'll grieve him honestly. God forgive me for saying it of the dead. You mean the family were unhappy under him? I mean, sir, that Sir Marcus was not a man who inspired love, whatever else he inspired. Fear, respect, obedience. Plenty of those. But love, no. She lowered her voice. There's things I've seen in this house, Captain Hastings, that I've kept to myself these many years, as a good servant should. But murder changes a body's notion of what's owed to silence. What sort of things, Mrs. Hartley? She hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. Lady Eleanor and Mr. Ashworth, sir. I don't say there's anything improper in it, mind, but they've been thick as thieves these 18 months past. Letters passed, meetings arranged when the master was from home, a closeness that a woman in my position learns to notice, whatever she says of it after. If Sir Marcus had learned of it, and I begin to think from certain remarks he let fall at dinner, that he had learned of it, well, a wife who fears her husband's discovery of an attachment, and a business partner who fears exposure and ruin besides, there's your motive twice over, if you ask me, though no one has. I relayed this at once to Poirot, who listened with the closest attention, nodding slowly. This accords with what I had already begun to suspect, Hastings, though Mrs. Hartley's testimony gives it a welcome particularity. Lady Eleanor's composure at dinner, when her husband hinted at discussing her position privately, it was the composure of a woman who has long rehearsed the scene of her own exposure and is determined not to be undone by it in public. And Ashworth's very evident nervousness beneath the joviality, a man juggling 2 separate ruins, financial and romantic, must feel the strain most keenly. Then you suspect them, Lady Eleanor and Ashworth working together? I suspect, said Poirot carefully, that they had, between them, motive enough to fill a very large ledger indeed. Whether they acted upon it is another matter entirely, and I do not think, Hastings, that we have yet heard the whole of what this household has to confess. There is still Dr. Voss, whose reaction to the body I found most curious, and there is still— He paused, and something in his expression grew distant and thoughtful. There is still Miss Fairweather, of whom I have not yet finished thinking. Chapter 9. The Secretary's Secret. It was Dr. Voss himself who came to us the following morning, unbidden, with the look of a man who has wrestled with his conscience through a sleepless night and lost. There is something I ought to have told you at once, Mr. Poirot, and did not, out of what I told myself was professional discretion, but which I now recognize as simple cowardice. He sat heavily, his usually ruddy face drawn and grey. Simon Latch came to me some 3 weeks ago, in considerable distress, and asked me a great many questions about digitalis, its effects, its dosage, how much would prove fatal, how such a dose might be disguised within a man's ordinary medicine. He said at the time that he asked out of concern for Sir Marcus's health, that he wished to understand the risks of the treatment I had prescribed. I believed him. I see now that I was perhaps a fool to do so. Poirot's eyes had sharpened with interest. Did he give you any reason to suppose his interest was other than what he claimed? None, at the time. But I have since learned, and this is the part I am most ashamed to have concealed, that Simon Latch had been systematically diverting small sums from the estate accounts these past 2 years, sums that Sir Marcus had begun, I believe, to suspect, though he had not yet confirmed it. Latch confided as much to me himself, in a moment of weakness, some months back, swearing me to secrecy and promising to make good the sums before discovery. I do not think he ever did so. This is a most significant addition to our understanding, Dr. Voss. Why do you tell us now, when you did not tell us before? The doctor's hands twisted together. Because I have been asking myself, these 2 sleepless nights, whether my silence has protected an innocent man's reputation or shielded a murderer, and I find I can no longer bear not knowing which. When Voss had gone, Poirot sat for some time in silent thought before summoning Simon Latch once more to the library, and this time, I observed, my friend's manner had lost its earlier gentleness. Mr. Latch, I think it is time you told me the truth, all of it. The secretary's composure, already fragile, collapsed entirely. I never meant for it to come to this, Mr. Poirot. I swear it. The money, yes, I took it, a little here, a little there, to cover debts I am too ashamed to name. I meant to replace it. I always meant to replace it. But Sir Marcus had begun asking questions these past weeks, questions I could not answer honestly, and I feared— He broke off, his voice cracking. I feared discovery and ruin and prison. I asked Dr. Voss about the digitalis because I thought, God forgive me, I thought that if I understood the danger, I might know how to guard against being blamed if his heart should fail of its own accord, as everyone always said it might. I never touched that bottle, Mr. Poirot. I swear before God I never touched it. And yet you delivered papers to a locked door at 1:45 midnight, and heard, or claimed to have heard, a clock ticking that had in fact already stopped, or been made to appear to have stopped, some 25 minutes before. I have told you the truth as I know it, Latch said, weeping now without restraint. I do not know why the clock deceived me. I only know that I did not kill him, whatever else I have done that shames me. Poirot regarded the broken man before him with an expression I found difficult to read. Not without sympathy, but not, I thought, entirely persuaded of his innocence either. You may go, Mr. Latch, he said at last. But I think you would do well not to leave this house, nor this district, until this matter is fully resolved. When Latch had gone, I turned to Poirot with some considerable relief. Well, Poirot, surely this settles the matter. Latch had motive enough, fear of discovery, ruin, the threat of prison, and he asked Voss those very particular questions about digitalis scarcely 3 weeks before the murder. It seems to me a very plain case. It seems plain, Hastings, precisely because it has been made to seem so, Poirot said, frowning into the fire. Observe how very readily Latch's guilt presents itself, once one particular thread is pulled. The embezzlement, the questions to Voss, the visit to the locked door at midnight, and yet consider also how very readily Julian's guilt presented itself an hour before that, once the moneylender's letter was discovered, and how very readily Ashworth's guilt suggested itself before that again, once the matter of Lady Eleanor came to light. Every suspect we examine, mon ami, offers us a complete and satisfying motive within the space of a single interview, as though the case had been constructed with a separate solution laid ready for each hour of our investigation. This is not, I think, how guilt generally reveals itself. Guilt is more often a stubborn and reluctant thing, uncovered only by patient labour against a witness's determined concealment. Here, it seems almost to present itself for our convenience, one candidate at a time, and I confess I grow rather more suspicious of this obliging pattern than I am persuaded by any single suspect within it. Then you believe Latch is innocent after all? I believe, Hastings, that Latch is guilty of theft and guilty of a coward's silence, but I do not yet believe him guilty of murder. A man capable of such patient and delicate poisoning as this case demonstrates does not, I think, break down and weep before a stranger's questioning within the space of 3 days. Our murderer, whoever he or she may prove to be, has shown us nerve enough to plan a death so carefully that even the hour of its occurrence has been disguised. Such nerve does not crumble so easily as Mr. Latch's has done this afternoon. Chapter 10. A Widow's Composure. It was, I think, the 4th day of our confinement, for the snow had at last begun to slacken, though the road remained treacherous, and Inspector Radley judged it unwise to attempt the journey to Thornbeck until the thaw had properly set in, that Poirot at last requested a private interview with Lady Eleanor Blackwood. She received us in the small morning room that had become, in these strange days, something like her private refuge, dressed in unrelieved black, that suited her dark colouring rather better, I confess, than I thought quite proper to observe in a woman so recently widowed. "I imagine you have come to ask me about Mr. Ashworth," she said, before Poirot had spoken a single word, "since I understand the servants' hall has been busy with very little else these 3 days past. You anticipate me most efficiently, madame. There is little point in delay, Mr. Poirot. Yes, Vivian Ashworth and I have been close these 18 months. I will not dignify it with a more romantic word than the truth deserves, nor will I pretend it was anything less than what it was. My marriage to Marcus Blackwood was, from very nearly its beginning, a bargain rather than a union. He wanted a wife of good family to grace his table, and I wanted security after my own family's fortunes had failed rather badly. We neither of us pretended otherwise, in private, whatever face we showed the world. And Sir Marcus had discovered this attachment? He had begun to suspect it, yes. His remark at dinner, about discussing my position privately, I understood it perfectly well, and so, I think, did Vivian, though neither of us dared show it before the whole table. Did you fear what he might do, madame, once his suspicions were confirmed? Lady Eleanor's composure, which had held so steadily through this recitation, wavered for the first time. I feared he would divorce me without a penny, Mr. Poirot, and see me ruined in the eyes of every family I have ever known. Marcus was not a man who forgave slights to his pride, and infidelity, real or merely suspected, he would have counted the gravest slight of all. This gives you, madame, a motive that I think you understand as well as I do. It gives me a motive to wish him divorced, or dead of natural causes at some convenient future date, Mr. Poirot, not a motive to poison him myself, in my own house, where suspicion must inevitably fall upon me before anyone else. Her voice had steadied again, and there was something almost defiant in it now. I did not kill my husband. I will confess to you freely that I did not love him, and that I do not grieve him with any great sincerity, whatever black I wear for the sake of appearances. But I did not kill him. Where were you, madame, between 11 o'clock and 1 in the morning of his death? In my room, alone. I have no witness to offer you, Mr. Poirot, beyond my own word, which I am aware carries little weight under the circumstances. One further question, madame, if you will permit it. You spoke just now of your family's fortunes having failed before your marriage. May I ask the particulars? Lady Eleanor's composure flickered, very briefly, into something like weariness. My father was a gentleman of good name and poor judgment, Mr. Poirot. He speculated badly, and lost the greater part of what remained of our family's estate in a series of unwise investments some years before I came of age. I will not pretend that my marriage to Marcus was made for love, when the truth is so much less flattering. I married him because he offered security, and because I had been raised to believe that a woman without fortune must secure her future by whatever respectable means present themselves. I do not think this makes me unique among women of my circumstances, Mr. Poirot, however little credit it does me to confess it. Did Sir Marcus know of your family's difficulties when he married you? He knew everything, Mr. Poirot. He made rather a point, in fact, of reminding me of it, in his gentler moments as much as his cruel ones, that he had rescued me, as he liked to put it, from a genteel poverty I should otherwise have been obliged to endure. I do not think he ever entirely forgave me for requiring rescue, any more than he forgave anyone else in this house for depending upon his generosity. It was, I have come to believe, the very foundation of his character. He could not love where he could not also feel himself the benefactor, and he could not forgive those he had benefited for the debt he considered them forever to owe him. This is a most illuminating portrait of your late husband, madame. It is the truest one I can offer you, Mr. Poirot, whatever else you may think of my honesty in other particulars. When she had gone, Poirot sat for some time turning his moustache between finger and thumb, a habit I had long since learned to associate with a mind working at its very fastest. A remarkably honest witness, all things considered, I ventured. Remarkably honest, Hastings, or remarkably skilled at the appearance of honesty, which is not always the same thing, though I confess the distinction is difficult to draw in this instance. He rose abruptly. I wish now to speak once more with Mr. Ashworth, and I think this time I shall be a good deal less patient with his joviality than I have hitherto permitted myself to be. The interview that followed confirmed, in its essentials, everything Lady Eleanor had already confessed, though delivered with considerably more bluster and considerably less dignity on Ashworth's part, and it added only one detail of significance, that Ashworth, by his own admission, had gone to Sir Marcus's study at some time after 11 the previous night, intending to plead for time regarding the Rotterdam accounts, and had found the door already locked, and, receiving no answer to his knock, had retired to his room believing Sir Marcus had already gone to bed. "You knocked, monsieur? You are certain of this? Mr. Latch has told us he did not knock, for fear of disturbing a sleeping man." "I knocked, Mr. Poirot, quite distinctly, twice. There was no answer. I assumed he did not wish to be disturbed, or had already retired, and I own I was rather relieved to postpone a difficult conversation." "And did you hear the clock, monsieur, ticking within?" Ashworth frowned in the effort of memory. "I couldn't say, Mr. Poirot. I wasn't listening for it. I heard nothing beyond the silence of a locked door, and I own I did not linger to listen more closely." When he had gone, Poirot turned to me with a peculiar light in his eye. "You observe, Hastings, that we now have two witnesses who visited that locked door at approximately the same hour of the night, one of whom claims to have heard a clock ticking that ought already to have stopped, and one of whom heard nothing at all. This is either a very great muddle of unreliable memory, or it is a very great clue, and I begin to believe most strongly that it is the latter." Chapter 11. The Ward's Quiet Grief. It was not until the 5th day, when the snow had at last ceased entirely, and a pale, watery sun had begun to break through the clouds over the moor, that Poirot returned to the subject of Constance Fairweather, and this time, I observed, with a different quality of attention than he had brought to any of our previous interviews. "Tell me, mademoiselle," he began, when she had once more seated herself in the library, composed as ever, her hands folded quietly in her lap, "of your life before you came to Blackwood Hall." "There is very little to tell, Mr. Poirot. My parents died when I was 12 years old. Sir Marcus, who had been acquainted with my father in some business capacity, took me in out of what I understood at the time to be charity, and educated me, and gave me a home, such as it was. Your father's name, mademoiselle." A very small pause, so small that I might almost have missed it, had I not been watching her as closely as Poirot himself. "Frederick Fairweather, Mr. Poirot. He was a merchant, in a small way, in Hull. And what became of his business, that you should have found yourself, at 12 years old, without parents and without provision, obliged to accept the charity of a man who had merely known your father in some business capacity. I was very young, Mr. Poirot. I do not recall the particulars. I understood only that there had been reverses, and that my father did not long survive them. Reverses, Poirot repeated softly. That is a very delicate word for a very great many kinds of ruin, mademoiselle. I wonder if you would permit me to press you a little further upon the point. What manner of reverses? For the first time in all our interviews, I saw something crack, very briefly, in Constance Fairweather's careful composure, a tightening about the eyes, quickly mastered, but not, I think, quickly enough to escape Poirot's notice. I was 12, Mr. Poirot, she said again, more firmly. Children are not generally told the particulars of their father's business failures. I understood only that we lost everything, and that my father did not survive the loss by very long. I see. Poirot's tone remained perfectly gentle, perfectly courteous, and yet I felt, listening, a current beneath the surface of the conversation that had not been present in any of our previous interviews. And it did not strike you as curious, mademoiselle, in all the 12 years since, to wonder more particularly into the causes of your father's ruin? Most people, I think, in your position, would wish very much to understand how such a catastrophe had come upon them. I preferred not to dwell upon painful things I could not change, Mr. Poirot. I do not think that is so very curious. Perhaps not, though I confess, mademoiselle, that in my experience, it is precisely the painful things we tell ourselves we do not dwell upon that occupy, in truth, the very greatest part of our private thoughts. He rose, with the air of a man concluding an interview rather sooner than he had originally intended. Thank you, Miss Fairweather. You have been most patient with my questions. When she had gone, I turned to Poirot in some bewilderment. You seemed almost to be pursuing a particular line there, Poirot, and yet you let her go without pressing the point home. Because, mon ami, I do not yet possess the fact that would make the pressing of the point worthwhile, and a good detective does not show his hand before he holds the winning card. But I will tell you this much, Hastings. I intend to send a telegram this very evening, the moment the lines are restored, to a correspondent of mine in Hull, and I intend to ask him a great many questions about a merchant named Frederick Fairweather, and the particular nature of the reverses that ruined him some 12 years past. I have a very strong suspicion, Hastings, that we shall find Sir Marcus Blackwood's name somewhere near the centre of that old and painful story. Chapter 12. The Breaking Point. The telegraph lines were restored late that same evening, and Poirot's message went out into the darkness with, I think, a greater weight of expectation than he cared to admit even to me. While we awaited a reply, the household continued in its uneasy state of suspended grief and mutual suspicion, and it was in this atmosphere that Julian Blackwood, cornered at last by the accumulating weight of evidence against him, broke down entirely. He came to us himself, late at night, his composure and his bravado both entirely spent, and confessed, with the desperate haste of a man who can no longer bear the burden of silence, that he had indeed gone to his father's study on the night of the murder, though not, he swore, with any thought of violence. I went to beg him, Mr. Poirot, he said, his voice breaking. Not for money. I know how that sounds, given the letter you found, but I swear it isn't true. I went to beg him not to go through with the new will, not because I cared so very much for the money itself, but because— he stopped, mastering himself with visible effort. Because I wanted, just once in my life, for my father to look at me as though I were worth something more than a disappointment to be managed. I thought if I could make him understand how much it wounded me, he might relent. I know now how foolish that hope was. And did you see him, monsieur? Did you speak with him? No. The door was locked when I tried it, some time before midnight. I couldn't tell you the exact hour. I wasn't watching the clock. I knocked, and there was no answer, and I told myself he had already gone to bed, and I was too great a coward, in the end, to knock again more loudly and risk waking the whole house to witness my humiliation. I went back to my room and I told no one, because I knew how it would look. and I was afraid, God help me, I was afraid of exactly what has now happened, that I should be suspected simply for having gone to that door at all. You are the third person, monsieur, to have visited that locked door on the night of the murder, and found no answer within, Poirot said slowly. This begins to seem less a case of concealment, I think, and more a case of a household in which everyone crept about in guilty secrecy that night, for reasons quite unconnected to murder, and each is now too ashamed or too frightened to admit it plainly. Then you believe me? I believe, monsieur, that you have told me a truth that costs you something to tell, which is generally, though not invariably, a sign of an honest witness. But I do not yet believe or disbelieve anything with the finality you seem to hope for. There remains a great deal more to be understood before this case is truly closed. It was in the small hours of that same night, as I lay wakeful in my room turning over the day's revelations, that I heard a soft knock at Poirot's door across the passage, and, rising to investigate, found a telegraph boy, who had evidently made the difficult journey from Thornbeck despite the lateness of the hour, the roads being at last passable, delivering a message that Poirot received with an expression of such intense and sudden gravity that I knew at once we had arrived at the very heart of the matter. He read it twice through in silence, and then handed it to me without a word. The message was brief, but its contents struck me with the force of a physical blow. Frederick Fairweather, merchant of Hull, had indeed been ruined some 12 years previously, ruined, according to my friend's correspondent, by the deliberate and calculated actions of a rival shipping concern that had undercut his contracts, poisoned his creditors' confidence, and driven him at last to a bankruptcy from which he never recovered, taking his own life within the year. The rival concern in question had been owned, at that time, by one Marcus Blackwood. Mon Dieu, I said softly. Constance Fairweather's father was ruined and driven to his death by Sir Marcus himself. Just so, Hastings, said Poirot, his voice very quiet. And a man who takes into his household, 12 years later, the orphaned daughter of a man he destroyed. I wonder very much now whether this was an act of genuine charity, or whether it was, perhaps, something closer to a trophy kept close at hand, a living reminder of a victory he could not resist gloating over in private, even as he presented it to the world as generosity. I begin to understand, I think, a great deal more about the character of our victim, and a very great deal more, too, about the character of the young woman who has sat these 12 years at his table, watching and waiting and saying nothing at all. Chapter 13. Fragments of the Past. The following morning, Poirot requested a further interview with Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, whose 20 years of service at Blackwood Hall made her, he judged, the person most likely to recall the precise circumstances of Constance Fairweather's arrival at the house so many years before. I remember it well, Mr. Poirot, though I never thought much of it at the time beyond what was told to me, Mrs. Hartley said, her brow furrowed in the effort of recollection. The master brought her himself, a thin, quiet little thing, and told the household she was the orphaned daughter of an old business acquaintance who had died leaving no provision for her, and that Christian charity obliged him to see her raised properly. He seemed, I recall, very pleased with himself over the arrangement, spoke of it often to visitors, as a kind of credit to his generosity. Did he ever speak, in your hearing, of the particular circumstances of her father's ruin? Once, Mr. Poirot, that I recall, and it has stayed with me all these years, though I did not understand its full weight until this very moment. He said to Mr. Ashworth, over their port one evening, not knowing I was still in the room clearing the table, that there was no sweeter charity than raising up the daughter of a man you'd been obliged to bring down in business. Those were very near his exact words, sir, and he laughed as he said them, as though it were a very good joke indeed. Poirot's face had gone quite still. And do you believe, madame, that Miss Fairweather ever came to learn the truth of this? That Sir Marcus himself was the author of her father's ruin? Mrs. Hartley hesitated. I couldn't swear to it, Mr. Poirot, but I recall, some 3 or 4 years back, finding Miss Constance in the study late one evening, going through some very old papers in the bottom drawer of the desk, shipping ledgers they looked like, from years before her time in this house. She told me she was merely curious about the business, and I thought nothing more of it then. I think of it rather differently now. When Mrs. Hartley had gone, Poirot sat for a long time in silence, his hands folded before him, his expression graver than I had seen it at any point in our investigation. I begin to see the whole shape of this tragedy, Hastings, and I confess it gives me very little pleasure to see it so clearly. A girl of 12, orphaned and ruined by the very man who then takes her into his house under the guise of charity, and who, if Mrs. Hartley's memory serves us correctly, has at some point in the years since discovered old papers that reveal to her the true author of her family's destruction. 12 years, mon ami, is a very long time to live beneath a man's roof, eating his bread, wearing his charity like a collar, knowing all the while what he had truly done. It is a very long time in which to plan, and to wait, and to grow patient. You believe it is Constance Fairweather, then? You believe she killed him? I believe, Hastings, that we have found the motive that outweighs every other motive in this house combined. Not greed, nor fear of ruin, nor wounded pride, but a grief and a rage 12 years in the tempering, controlled so perfectly for so long that she was able to sit at that dinner table 3 nights ago and hear her guardian threaten and humiliate every other soul present, and show, throughout, not the smallest flicker of satisfaction at what she had already, perhaps, resolved to do. That is not the composure of an innocent woman, Hastings. That is the composure of a woman who has waited 12 years for precisely this outcome, and finds, now that it has come, that she need only remain calm a little longer to see it safely accomplished.
But how did she do it?
The locked door, the altered clock. Ah. Poirot rose, and there was, for the first time in several days, something almost like satisfaction in his manner, the satisfaction of a man who sees, at last, the final pieces of a difficult puzzle arranging themselves into their proper places. For that, mon ami, I believe I must ask Miss Fairweather one further question, and I believe, this time, she will find it a good deal more difficult to answer with her customary composure. Chapter 14. The threads converge. Poirot did not go at once to Constance Fairweather, as I had expected. Instead, he asked me to accompany him once more to the study, and there he stood for a long while before the grandfather clock, his head tilted, his eyes narrowed in the particular manner that I had long since learned to associate with the final assembling of a solution. Consider with me, Hastings, the sequence of events as we now understand them. Sir Marcus dismisses his valet at 11, announcing his intention to work upon his correspondence. Some time after this, at least 3 persons, Mr. Latch, Mr. Ashworth and Julian Blackwood, each independently approach the study door and find it locked, receiving no answer. Latch believes he hears the clock ticking at 11:45. Ashworth, knocking at some unspecified hour, hears nothing at all. Julian, at an hour he cannot precisely name, likewise receives no answer. Yes, I follow you so far. Now, Hastings, let us suppose, merely suppose for the moment, that Sir Marcus Blackwood was already dead well before 11 o'clock, not poisoned in the manner we have assumed, at his desk, alone, in the depths of the night, but poisoned earlier, in the drawing-room or elsewhere, his whisky prepared and delivered to him before he ever retired to his study at all, and that he returned to that room already dying, locked the door out of some final instinct of privacy, as a proud man might wish to die unwitnessed, and expired there within the hour, considerably before 11 o'clock, rather than after it. But the clock stopped at 11:20. The clock, mon ami, is precisely the detail our murderer wished us to trust, and precisely the detail I have come to distrust above all others. Consider, if the clock's hands were moved forward, by a patient hand with ample opportunity, from some earlier true hour to 20 past 11, and the mechanism then deliberately stopped, by removing the weight, say, or jamming the pendulum, then every witness who later claims to have heard, or not heard, that clock ticking through a locked door becomes wholly irrelevant to establishing the true hour of death. We have been chasing 3 innocent and frightened people through a maze constructed entirely from a false clue, Hastings, while the true hour of the murder lies earlier than any of us have troubled to consider. How much earlier? I believe, mon ami, that Sir Marcus Blackwood took his poisoned whisky at very nearly 10 o'clock, perhaps even before dinner had properly concluded in the drawing-room, and that he was dead, or very nearly so, well before any of our 3 midnight visitors ever approached that door at all. Which means, Hastings, that the person who administered the poison had opportunity in the early evening, in the ordinary bustle of the household retiring for the night, when a hand might slip unnoticed into the study to alter both bottle and clock before Sir Marcus had even risen from the dinner table. And who had such an opportunity? Almost anyone, in the strictest sense. But only one person, I think, possessed also the particular skill and the particular patience that this crime required. Consider, Hastings, the delicacy of it, the precise measurement of the digitalis, sufficient to kill, but not so much as to cause immediate and obvious symptoms that might alarm a household still at dinner, the careful resetting of the clock's hands to a plausible hour, the calm, unhurried nerve to accomplish all of this while a dozen people moved about the house within call. This is not the work of a frightened debtor seizing a sudden opportunity, nor an angry mistress lashing out in a moment of desperation. This is the work of a mind that has rehearsed this evening, in imagination, 100 times over many years, and has at last found the courage, or the necessity, to make imagination real. He turned from the clock at last and faced me with an expression of profound gravity. I am going to ask Miss Fairweather one question, Hastings, and I believe her answer, or her silence, will tell us everything we require to know. Come, there is no purpose in delaying further. Chapter 15. The Confession. We found Constance Fairweather in the small conservatory at the rear of the house, where she had apparently taken to spending her afternoons among Sir Marcus's collection of hothouse orchids, a detail that struck me, once Poirot had begun to speak, with a significance I had not previously suspected. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began without preamble, "I wish to ask you about a particular species of foxglove that I understand grows wild upon this estate, and which I am given to understand you have some considerable knowledge of, having studied botany rather seriously in the years since you came to this house." Constance's hands, which had been arranging a spray of orchids in a shallow dish of water, went suddenly still. Digitalis purpurea, mademoiselle, is the common foxglove from which the medicine that killed your guardian is derived. It is not, I think, a difficult matter for a person with genuine botanical knowledge to understand how such a substance might be concentrated, or how a prescribed dose might be augmented without immediate detection, particularly if that person had access, over some years, to the same physician's records and the same household medicine chest. She did not answer at once, and in the silence that followed I watched something in her bearing change. Not collapse exactly, but a kind of settling, as though a great weight she had carried very carefully for a very long time had at last been permitted to rest. "You know then," she said at last, very quietly, "I know that your father, Frederick Fairweather, was ruined and driven to his death by the deliberate machinations of Sir Marcus Blackwood some 12 years ago, and that Sir Marcus took you into his house afterward, not from charity, mademoiselle, but as what I believe he himself once described, in an unguarded moment, as a kind of trophy, a living monument, to a victory he could not resist savouring in private, even as he paraded it before the world as generosity. I know that you discovered old shipping ledgers in that very study some years past, and that you have known, since that discovery, precisely what manner of man had raised you, and precisely what he had done to the father you scarcely remember. Constance set down the orchids very carefully, as though even now, at the end of everything, she could not bear to be careless with a living thing. He used to speak of my father sometimes, Mr. Poirot, in his cups, not knowing that I understood the true shape of what he described. He thought it a fine joke. The little Fairweather girl, sitting at my table, wearing my charity, and never once suspecting whose hand had truly orphaned her. I found the ledgers when I was 19, and I understood, then, everything he had done, not merely to my father's business, but to a dozen other men besides, ruined quietly, methodically, over the years, so that Marcus Blackwood might build his fortune upon the wreckage of theirs. I have spent 5 years since that discovery, learning to wear a composure I did not feel, Mr. Poirot, waiting for an opportunity I was not entirely certain I would ever have the courage to take. And 3 nights ago, mademoiselle, you found that courage. 3 nights ago, Mr. Poirot, he sat at that table and destroyed his son, and humiliated his wife, and threatened his oldest partner with ruin, with precisely the same casual cruelty with which he had destroyed my father 12 years before. And I understood, watching him, that he would never stop, that there would always be another Frederick Fairweather, another ruined family, another orphaned child raised up as a private jest, so long as Marcus Blackwood continued to live and continued to enjoy the exercise of his power over other people's lives. I put the digitalis in his whisky before dinner was even properly concluded, while the household was occupied with its own small dramas of guilt and fear, and I moved the clock's hands and stopped its mechanism while everyone else was still at table, for I had studied his habits for years, and I knew precisely when the room would stand empty. I am not sorry for what I have done, Mr. Poirot, though I am sorry, I think, for what it has cost the innocent people in this house, who have spent these past days suspected in my place. You allowed Julian, and Ashworth, and Mr. Latch, each to be examined and suspected, mademoiselle, knowing all the while that you alone bore the guilt. I did not arrange for them to be suspected, Mr. Poirot. I merely declined to clear their names at the cost of my own, which I think any person facing the gallows might be forgiven for hesitating to do. But I will not see an innocent man hang for what I have done. I never intended that. I intended only that I should not be caught before I had made my peace with what I had done. And I believe, from the calm with which you have laid this all before me, that my peacemaking is now very nearly at its end. Chapter 16. Poirot assembles the household. That same evening, with Inspector Radley's somewhat reluctant permission, Poirot requested that the entire household assemble in the drawing-room, where, some 5 nights before, Sir Marcus Blackwood had made the fatal announcement that set this whole tragedy in motion. They came in slowly, one by one, Lady Eleanor, pale and composed, Julian, his earlier bravado entirely spent, Ashworth, mopping perpetually at his brow, Latch, wringing his hands, Dr. Voss, grave and watchful, Mrs. Hartley, standing quietly near the door, as though uncertain of her right to remain. Constance Fairweather came last of all, and took the same seat by the window she had occupied on that first evening. Her composure, I noted with some wonder, as perfect and unshaken as it had been throughout our entire investigation. Mesdames, Messieurs, Poirot began, standing before the cold hearth with his hands clasped behind his back. I have asked you to gather here this evening because I believe the mystery of Sir Marcus Blackwood's death is now at last fully understood, and I think it is owed to each of you, who have suffered these past days beneath a cloud of mutual suspicion, to hear the truth laid plainly before you. He paused, surveying the room with his bright, unhurried eyes. I will say first, for the comfort of those who have suffered most unjustly beneath that cloud, that Mr. Julian Blackwood did not kill his father, though he went that night to beg a mercy his father would very likely never have granted. Mr. Ashworth did not kill his partner, though he went that night hoping to postpone a reckoning he could not ultimately have escaped. Mr. Latch did not kill his employer, though he had indeed embezzled from him, and though his fear of discovery led him to ask Dr. Voss certain questions he now bitterly regrets having asked. Each of these three gentlemen visited a locked door that night and received no answer, and each has spent these past days believing, in his private heart, that this silence alone might be sufficient to hang him. I am happy to tell you that it is not, for the very simple reason that Sir Marcus Blackwood was already dead, gentlemen, well before any of you ever approached that door at all. A murmur ran through the room. Radley, standing near the doorway with two constables at his back, leaned forward with close attention. The clock in the study, which appeared to have stopped at 20 minutes past 11, was in fact stopped a good deal earlier than that hour, its hands deliberately advanced to suggest a time of death, some considerable distance from the truth. This was done, I believe, at some moment when the household was occupied at dinner, or dispersing from it, and the study stood conveniently empty, a window of opportunity that required, above all else, an intimate knowledge of this household's habits, accumulated not over days or weeks, but over years. I should explain, for the benefit of those who have not followed each turn of this investigation as closely as Captain Hastings and myself, precisely how such a deception was accomplished, for I think it does credit to the ingenuity of the person who devised it, however dark the purpose it served. Poirot moved to stand before the fireplace, warming to his subject in the manner I had so often observed in him at the conclusion of a difficult case. The clock in Sir Marcus's study was wound every evening at 10 o'clock by Mrs. Hartley's own careful hand, and ran, when properly wound, for some 30 hours before requiring attention again. A person wishing to suggest a death occurring some hour or more later than the truth need only enter that study in the brief window between the household's rising from dinner and Sir Marcus's own return to his desk, advance the clock's hands to whatever hour seemed most useful to the deception, and then arrest the pendulum itself. A simple enough operation, requiring only a moment's steady hand and a knowledge, gained through long years of residence in this house, of precisely when such a moment might safely be found. The clock would then appear, to any subsequent observer, to have run down naturally at the hour indicated, rather than having been deliberately silenced at an hour of the murderer's own choosing. "But the whiskey, Mr. Poirot," Ashworth said, his voice unsteady. "How was the poison introduced, if Sir Marcus took his glass with him from the drawing-room, as I understood he generally did?" Sir Marcus, gentlemen, was a creature of the most rigid habit, as I think everyone in this room will readily confirm. He took a glass of whiskey and water each evening at very nearly the same hour, poured from the same decanter that stood always upon the sideboard in this very drawing-room, and carried it with him to his study when he rose to attend to his correspondence. A person familiar with this habit, as familiar indeed as only someone who has watched it repeated, night after night, for a dozen years could possibly be, required only a moment's unobserved access to that decanter at any point in the evening before Sir Marcus rose to pour his own glass, to ensure that the fatal dose awaited him, however innocently he believed himself to be serving it. It is, I confess, one of the most patient and carefully rehearsed methods of murder I have encountered in a long career of such investigations, and I do not say this, mesdames, messieurs, in admiration, but in the gravest sorrow, for it speaks of a wound carried so long and nursed so carefully that only death itself could finally bring it to rest. His gaze moved, slowly and without apparent haste, toward the window seat. The poison itself, mesdames, messieurs, was not administered at midnight in that locked study, as we were all encouraged to believe, but very much earlier, placed in Sir Marcus's whiskey before he had even properly risen from the dinner table on that terrible evening. This required a knowledge not merely of digitalis and its effects, which any careful reader of a medical dictionary might acquire, but a botanist's particular understanding of the plant from which it derives, an understanding I have learnt belongs, in this house, to precisely one person. Chapter 17. The Reveal. Every eye in the room turned now toward Constance Fairweather, who sat very still by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her pale gaze fixed upon Poirot with an expression of perfect composure that I think none of us, watching, could quite comprehend. "Miss Fairweather," Poirot said gently, "I do not think it is necessary for me to speak the accusation aloud, when I believe you have already prepared yourself, these many years, for the moment when it must at last be spoken." "No, Mr. Poirot," she said, and her voice, when it came, was perfectly steady. "I do not think it is necessary at all. I killed Marcus Blackwood. I have known I would have to say so, sooner or later, since the moment I first understood who you were and why you had been summoned to this house." Lady Eleanor's hand rose to her mouth. Ashworth sat frozen, his glass halfway to his lips. Julian stared at the quiet young woman by the window, as though seeing her, truly, for the first time in all the years they had lived beneath the same roof. "Constance," Julian began, half rising. "Please," she said, not unkindly, "let me finish, for I find, now that I have begun, that I do not wish to leave it half-spoken." She turned back to Poirot. "You have understood it very nearly all, Mr. Poirot, but I think I owe this room the whole of it, since they have suffered these past days under a suspicion that was never rightly theirs to bear. And there, in that firelit drawing-room, with the snow at last melting from the eaves outside, and Inspector Radley's constables standing quiet and watchful by the door, Constance Fairweather told her story from its beginning. The death of her father, the discovery of the ledgers, the 5 years of patient, terrible waiting, and the single evening in which patience had at last given way to action. I loved orchids because Sir Marcus permitted me the conservatory as the one indulgence of my confinement here, and it was there, among his own hothouse specimens, that I first began to study the family of plants to which the foxglove belongs. Innocently at first, I promise you, out of nothing more than a young girl's interest in growing things. It was only later, after I had found the ledgers, that I began to understand what use such knowledge might one day serve. I did not act in haste, Mr. Poirot. I acted only when I understood, at last, that Sir Marcus would never stop, that Julian would be ruined as thoroughly as my own father had been, that Lady Eleanor would be cast off without mercy, that Vivian Ashworth would be destroyed for the crime of having once trusted a man who trusted no one in return. I told myself, that final evening, that I was not merely avenging my own father, but preventing a fresh ruin about to fall upon this entire table. "And do you feel," Poirot asked quietly, "that this justifies what you have done?" Constance was silent for a long moment. "I do not know that anything justifies the taking of a life, Mr. Poirot, whatever the provocation. I know only that I could not, in the end, watch him continue as he was, and that I have paid, these 5 years of waiting and these 3 days of watching innocent men suspected in my place, a price I do not think I shall ever fully finish paying, whatever sentence the law now sees fit to impose." Inspector Radley stepped forward at last, his manner grave but not unkind. "Miss Fairweather, I must ask you to come with me." "Of course, Inspector." She rose with the same quiet composure that had marked her throughout our entire acquaintance, and paused only once, at the door, to look back at the assembled household, at Julian, whose face had crumpled into something like grief, at Lady Eleanor, who had begun, very softly, to weep, at Ashworth, who could not meet her eyes at all. "I am sorry," she said simply, "for what my silence cost each of you these past days. I never intended that any of you should suffer for what I alone had done." And with that she left the room, and the case of Sir Marcus Blackwood's death, in every practical sense, was closed. Chapter 18. The Reflection. It was some hours later, when the household had at last dispersed to its various private griefs, and the fire in the library had burned low, that Poirot and I found ourselves alone together, as we had so often been at the conclusion of some dark and difficult case, each turning the events of the preceding days over, in a silence that asked, without words, to be broken. "You knew, I think, rather earlier than you let on," I said at last. "You suspected her from very nearly the first interview." "I suspected her, mon ami, as I told you at the time, precisely because she was the least likely candidate the eye naturally settled upon. And it has been my experience, across many years and many such cases, that the person a room overlooks is very often the person who has had the most leisure to plan, undisturbed by the scrutiny that falls, quite naturally, upon those whose grievances are loud and visible. Julian's debts, Ashworth's embezzlement, Lady Eleanor's infidelity, Latch's theft. These were grievances that announced themselves, that Sir Marcus himself had taken pains to announce at that fatal dinner. But Constance Fairweather's grievance was 12 years old and utterly silent, and I think that is precisely why it proved, in the end, the most dangerous grievance in the house. Do you think she was right, Poirot, that Sir Marcus would truly have continued as he was, ruining others, until someone stopped him? Poirot was quiet for a long moment, gazing into the dying fire. "I think, Hastings, that Sir Marcus Blackwood was a man who mistook cruelty for strength and domination for love, and who built about himself, across a long and successful life, a household of people bound to him not by affection, but by fear and dependency. And I think such households, mon ami, are very often more dangerous to the man at their centre than he ever suspects, for he mistakes the silence of the frightened for the loyalty of the devoted, and he does not trouble himself to notice when that silence begins, at last, to curdle into something else entirely." "But murder, Poirot! Surely nothing excuses it, whatever the provocation." "No, Hastings, I do not think murder is ever, in the final accounting, excused by provocation, however terrible. I have said as much to Miss Fairweather herself, and I believe, in her own quiet way, she agrees with me. It is why she confessed so readily, once the truth was laid before her, rather than continuing to protest an innocence she had, by then, no further wish to maintain. Justice, mon ami, is not a thing that private hands may properly administer, however grievously they have been wronged. For the moment we permit each aggrieved person to become judge and executioner both, we abandon the very principle that separates a civilized society from a battlefield. And yet—" He paused, and something almost sorrowful crossed his usually inscrutable features. "And yet I confess, Hastings, that I have rarely concluded a case with less satisfaction in the triumph of my own little grey cells, and rather more sympathy for the murderer than I generally permit myself to feel. Sir Marcus Blackwood built a fortune upon the ruin of other men's lives, and dressed his cruelties in the language of charity and generosity, and I think, in the end, he was undone not by any external enemy, but by the very household of silent, watchful people he had gathered about himself, believing them too dependent, too frightened, ever to turn against him. What will happen to her now? She will stand trial, Hastings, and I think a jury may find rather more mercy in its heart than the strict letter of the law generally permits, once the whole history of Frederick Fairweather's ruin is laid before them, as I have no doubt her counsel will ensure that it is. Whether that mercy will bring her any true peace, I cannot say. I think perhaps she has carried her grief so long and so alone that even a merciful sentence will come to her more as a kind of rest than as any true restoration of what she lost 12 years ago. Outside, the last of the snow had finally ceased, and through the tall library windows I could see the first pale stars emerging over the silent moor, the road to Thornbeck at last passable, the strange, terrible confinement of Blackwood Hall drawing at last to its close. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said, rising at last and settling his waistcoat with something of his old precision, though his eyes, I thought, remained shadowed by the case in a manner I had not often observed in him before. "There is nothing more for the little grey cells to accomplish here, and I confess I find myself rather looking forward to a good dinner, a comfortable bed, and a journey home that does not require me to suspect my fellow travellers of murder before the soup is even served." We left Blackwood Hall the following morning, as the household began, each in their own fashion, the long and difficult business of rebuilding a life from the wreckage Sir Marcus Blackwood had left behind him. A wreckage, I could not help reflecting, that had begun not with his death, but a great many years before it, in the quiet ruin of a merchant in Hull, whose name, until that final terrible evening, almost no one in that grand and gloomy house had ever troubled themselves to remember. As our motor car carried us at last down the long drive and out onto the Thornbeck Road, I glanced back once at the great grey house rising behind us, its mullioned windows catching the pale morning light, and I found myself thinking not of Sir Marcus Blackwood, whose cruelty had set this tragedy in motion, but of the quiet, watchful girl who had sat so many years at his table, learning patience where she might have been taught love, and I wondered how very differently this story might have ended had anyone in that house thought, even once in 12 long years, to ask her what she carried so silently behind her calm and composed young face. "You are very quiet this morning, Hastings," Poirot observed, settling himself more comfortably against the cushions. "I was thinking, Poirot, that this has been a very sad case, whatever justice may say of it." "It has been, I think, the saddest case of my career, mon ami," Poirot said softly. "Precisely because I do not believe, in this instance, that we have caught a monster. I believe we have caught a wound that was never permitted to heal, until it had no remedy left to it but the very violence that made it. That is a melancholy thought to carry away from Yorkshire, and I do not think, Hastings, that even the excellent dinner I intend to order at York Station this evening will entirely dispel it. The end."